This video is about
American history.
This video will review some of the highlights of George Washington's presidency. Before we start, let's just establish Washington was already famous before he became president of the United States. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country. He was a veteran of the French and Indian War. He had been chosen to lead the Continental Army against the British during the American Revolution, and he was selected as the presiding officer of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. He's a pretty popular guy. You've already studied how Americans elect a president and a vice president, but by way of quick review, the people who are eligible to vote do not vote directly for the president and vice president. Their individual votes are instead used to determine who will participate in the Electoral College. The members of the Electoral College then place votes for president and vice president, and those votes are counted by Congress. The earliest elections of this new country were slightly different. For one thing, very few states chose their electors through a popular vote. Instead, electors were chosen by the state legislatures. In the first four presidential elections, 1789, 1792, 1796, and 1800, each electoral college member received 2 votes for president. After that, and we'll see why, each elector was then given 1 vote for president and 1 vote for vice president. But before 1800, it was 2 votes for president. Washington was supposed to be inaugurated on March 4th, 1789. Unfortunately, a very long winter prevented a majority of the members of Congress from arriving in New York on time. Once there was a majority, which is about a month later, they could count the ballots. All 69 electors cast 1 vote for George Washington. Among the remaining votes, John Adams won the most at 34, so he became the vice president. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington took the oath of office on a balcony at Federal Hall overlooking Wall Street in New York City, the nation's capital at the time. And even today, you can walk down Wall Street and see this balcony. There's a little plaque there, and this church, which is just at the end of Wall Street, you can go in and visit as well. Here's a copy of the oath taken from the Constitution. And what's really important to note here is that the functions of the president are all about the Constitution. The Constitution is the highest law in the land, and the president is there to make sure it is preserved, protected, and defended as such. One of the first things Washington did when he got into office was get Congress to start working on creating the judicial branch of the federal government. So one of the first laws that gets passed under Washington as president is the Judiciary Act of 1789. That created a 6-member Supreme Court with 1 Chief Justice, or one person who's sort of in charge administratively of the court. The first Chief Justice of the United States was a guy named John Jay, whose picture you can see here in this sketch of 4 of the first Supreme Court justices. The Judiciary Act of 1789 said that the Supreme Court had jurisdiction in 4 areas. The first jurisdiction was action between states. So let's pretend that New Jersey and New York disagree about the boundary between their states. They would take that complaint to the Supreme Court. The next jurisdiction is action between a state and the United States federal government. So if we, just for example, if Virginia felt that the United States government was infringing on Virginia's states' rights, and they wanted to take the federal government to court, then the court they would take them to is the Supreme Court. The next jurisdiction is cases brought against diplomatic personnel. Now that's people from other countries who are living in the United States and serving as diplomats to their home country. So if the US government wanted to put a foreign diplomat on trial, they would do that in the Supreme Court. And the final jurisdiction is appeals that come from lower court decisions. And that is the system in many countries, including Canada, where people can appeal court decisions all the way up to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court will decide whether or not to hear the appeal and then rule. And the Supreme Court is just that. It is the highest court in the land, and so its decision is final. And the reality of the Constitutional Convention was that they spent so much time trying to figure out how the legislative branch of the government would work that they were not left with much time to map out the judiciary. George Washington ensured that there would be an effective judiciary branch by signing a law that had it created as quickly as possible. And speaking of the Constitutional Convention, the end result was a much stronger central government, and that freaked a lot of Americans out. They'd just spent 8 years fighting to be freed from a strong central government, and here a bunch of Americans were suggesting that they should have a new one. So the framers of the Constitution wanted something put in that would protect the citizens from the overwhelming power of the central government. Many states said that they would only agree to ratify the Constitution if some amendments were made to the Constitution. These amendments, and there ended up being 10 of them, were collectively known as the Bill of Rights, and that was added to the Constitution. The Bill of Rights identified individual freedoms that citizens had, but had not been specified in the original draft of the Constitution. The Bill of Rights basically says what the limits are on the federal government's power and authority. For example, the amendments include rights such as freedom of religion, speech, the press, and assembly in public. That was all in the First Amendment, which is a big one, because having all of that in one is symbolic of the federal government's attempts to establish a strong central government that will not, and in fact legally cannot, do to its citizens what American revolutionaries said the King of England had done. The Bill of Rights also included not allowing troops to be quartered in private homes. And if you remember the uproar in pre-revolution Boston, you can understand why this amendment was made to the Constitution. And it's number 3 on the list. It's pretty high up there. The Fifth Amendment says that the federal government cannot force a citizen to incriminate themselves. You may have heard the expression on TV or in conversations with people about pleading the Fifth, and that's a reference to the Fifth Amendment. What does all this have to do with Washington? Well, when he went inside Federal Hall after taking the oath, one of the main points in his speech was to ask Congress to draft amendments to the Constitution that focused on the rights of individual citizens. So Washington made sure that the Bill of Rights became a part of the Constitution, and that ensured that the new country and the Constitution would survive. Once in office, Washington surrounded himself with a number of trusted advisors and supporters. He created the first executive offices, and this group of people who filled these executive offices became known as the cabinet. These positions are not required by the Constitution, but the creation of these offices allowed for the more efficient running of the federal government. And there were 4 offices in the original cabinet. First was Secretary, or one of them was Secretary of State, and their job was to manage or look after foreign affairs. The first Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. The second cabinet position was Secretary of the Treasury, which you might figure out for yourself was about the nation's finances. And the first Secretary of the Treasury was a man named Alexander Hamilton. Third position was Secretary of War, which, again, these aren't very creative names, but the Secretary of War was responsible for all military affairs. And the next one was the Attorney General, and that obviously has to do with legal. That person or that person's offices act as the government's lawyers or the government's representation on legal issue. I've provided the names of 2 men in Washington's first cabinet because their differences of opinion have had a tremendous effect on American politics and history. For now, I'm just going to point out that Thomas Jefferson had been the U.S. Minister to France during the French Revolution. He believed very much in placing limits on the strength of the central government and on giving individual citizens the freedom to pursue their own fortunes. The other one I want to draw your attention to is Alexander Hamilton. He served in the Revolution and became eventually the personal assistant to General Washington. And he believed in a very strong central government, so the opposite of Jefferson. His opinion was based on his doubts in the ability of the common man to make effective decisions about government. By way of demonstration, in the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton had argued that the president should be elected for life based on the British monarchy model. That's how much of a fan he was of strong central authority. So I just wanted to point those 2 guys out because their names come up again and again in American history. Washington's third accomplishment has to do with the economy. Trade with Britain did not return to pre-revolution levels when the revolution was over. Here you can see the trough or the low point in trade between England and the United States during the American Revolution. And after the revolution, you'll notice that the blue line is imports from England, so that is money that Americans are spending. The gray line is exports to England, so that's money that the Americans are making. There's a huge trade deficit here, not in the Americans' favor. And this trade deficit is actually almost double what the trade deficit was when they were colonies. So the economic situation has actually got much worse for them. And Washington worked with a number of people to try to right the American economy when he was president. Going back to Alexander Hamilton, he wished to establish a strong central government by proposing to have the federal government assume the state's debts. He wanted to do this for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that it would encourage support for the federal government at the state level. Suddenly, a state doesn't have to pay off its debt anymore. The federal government is going to take care of it. The second thing is financially, it would improve the new country's credibility. If it could pay off these debts, then other countries around the world would see the United States as a strong or sound financial country. Washington signed the Assumption Bill into law in 1790. The second part of it was that Washington signed a law that created a national bank or a federal bank. Creating the bank was again intended to solidify the financial position and reputation of the government. The bank could do a number of things. It could issue loans to corporations, to the government, to individuals. It would be the place where the federal government would keep its money. So the money that it collects in taxes would be kept in the federal bank. And there would also be effective oversight of federal spending and revenues. As the money goes into the bank and out of the bank, there would be oversight into every transaction that happens. There would be a record in the bank of that transaction. The third attempt to right the financial ship was Washington signed a bill that would generate some of those revenues to go into the federal bank through tariffs and taxes. And one tax in particular is an excise tax on whiskey, and that law was passed in 1791. What's scary about this particular tax is that it was the first federal tax that the government tried to pass, and getting federal taxes was impossible under the Articles of Confederation. And here we have a strong central authority taxing directly the citizens of the United States. And that hadn't happened since the Sugar and Stamp Acts in the 1760s. So everybody's a little bit nervous about this one. And in fact, in rural Pennsylvania, which was the frontier of the country at the time, and it's kind of difficult to imagine Pennsylvania being the frontier, but Pennsylvania was the western frontier of the country, and farmers there were very upset about the tax on whiskey. These farmers sometimes found that they had excess grain after the harvest, and they would distill that grain into whiskey, which they would then sell. They actively resisted paying the taxes on this additional income. They tarred and feathered tax collectors, and they actually threatened further violence. As their frustration grew, they actually organized a march on Pittsburgh, and there's some debate about who fired first, but shots were fired during this march on Pittsburgh. This is what has become known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Again, it makes total sense that a bunch of people who had lived through the Revolution based on resisting an authoritarian government would resist the next government that came along that they saw as authoritarian. And in this case, it's George Washington's government imposing a direct tax on the people. Washington's next accomplishment is actually how he reacts to the Whiskey Rebellion. When word got back to the government that farmers in Pennsylvania were actively resisting the collection of the tax, it was interpreted as a challenge to the new government's legitimacy. And it was. The government and Washington needed to decide if they were going to assert the strength of this new federal government or have it collapse under the pressure of some people who didn't want to be taxed. Washington's decision was to invoke a law that allowed the president to summon state militia. He gathered an army of 13,000 men to go to Pennsylvania to put down the rebellion, and historians have estimated the number of rebels at its height to be about 500. How did Washington get so many troops from these individual states? Well, he said that he was going to lead the army himself, and that's what he did. And it's a testament to Washington's popularity, or the respect that citizens had for him, that first he was able to raise 13,000 men. But then before Washington and his army could even get to Pennsylvania, the rebellion had stopped. No one was interested in facing George Washington on the field of battle. Washington's commitment to the new government structure, its rights and responsibilities, is demonstrated in this act. And in theory, the first president of the United States could have been killed on the field of battle in a fight against his own citizens, but he was willing to take that risk. Now let's switch our focus from domestic affairs to international affairs. Remember, this is a new country. It has to figure out who its friends and enemies are around the world. The other thing about being a young country, the new government and the people it governs are still getting settled. Their economy is in great shape, so introducing war into the equation is a dangerous idea. Washington tries to take some steps with regard to foreign relations to try to protect the young country in its early years. The first thing that I want to point out is in 1793, the Proclamation of Neutrality. In 1793, France had declared war on Britain. Washington and the cabinet felt that the U.S. was too young and delicate, politically speaking, to enter into an international war. So what Washington said was he declared the U.S. to be neutral in this war, and that it wasn't bound to any side in the battle. The next step was in 1794 to pass the Neutrality Act. And what the Neutrality Act did was made it illegal for an American citizen to wage war against any country at peace with the United States. So if the United States and France are at peace, then an American citizen can't go to England and volunteer to fight in the British Army against France. Then the next one, also in 1794, is Jay's Treaty, and this is a big one. Jay's Treaty is a peace treaty between the United States and Great Britain. There's still some unresolved issues after the American Revolution. Great Britain believed that it was owed a bunch of money from the Revolutionary War, and the United States wanted the British to get out of a bunch of forts that they were still in the Northwest. So John Jay, remember him? He negotiates that treaty with England, and once it is signed, it actually creates almost a decade of peace and prosperity between the United States and Great Britain. So the youngest country in the world in 1794 establishes very prosperous trade relations with the strongest country in the world, arguably at the time, which is Great Britain. The next accomplishment for Washington was the location of the federal government. Washington was sworn into office in New York City, but the capital moved from there to Philadelphia, and that was just a temporary measure. The U.S. Constitution said that the federal government needed its own land from which it could execute its role. And it was important to the framers of the Constitution that the federal government not be inside one particular state, because that state may be able to exert some sort of influence on the federal government, and nobody wanted that. The Residence Act of 1790 struck a committee to find a permanent seat of government. The committee hired surveyors to spot a plot of land along the Potomac River. Washington used to be a surveyor before his life took a very different turn, so he took a very personal interest in this project. When the surveyors and the committee found a place that they liked and could secure, they decided to call it Washington in honor of the first president of the United States. I will say this, the Resident Act was part of a larger plan called the Compromise of 1790. The Compromise of 1790 was something that Hamilton negotiated because he needed Southern support for his Assumption Bill. So in exchange for that support from the South, he offered Northern support for locating the federal capital in the Chesapeake region, which is further south, and that's where Washington, D.C. ended up being. The next accomplishment for Washington is that during his 2 presidential terms, 5 states were inducted into the Union. The population of the United States was spreading west, especially in the southern U.S., and this led to the creation of new states. 2 of the states that entered the Union were members of the original 13 colonies that had not yet ratified the Constitution. North Carolina joined the Union in 1789, and Rhode Island joined in 1790. 3 new states were also created. Vermont, which had existed as an independent republic since 1777, joined the United States in 1791. Part of Vermont's entry into the Union was meant to act as a counterbalance to the entry of the slave state, Kentucky, in 1792. The 5th state that was granted statehood under Washington's administration was Tennessee, and they were admitted in 1796. As Washington's second term was coming to a close, many expected and wanted him to run for a 3rd term. But Washington felt that he had served his country to the best of his ability through the difficult first years of nationhood. He believed it was time for someone new to assume the highest political position of the land. Part of his thinking also was that he did not want to encourage the idea of a president holding on to power indefinitely. So he refused to run for a 3rd term. And that actually created a tradition in the United States of presidents only serving for 2 terms. Eventually, there was a constitutional amendment that said presidents could only serve for 2 terms. Another thing that Washington did when he announced his retirement was he wrote a public letter, which is known as his farewell address, in 1796. And he highlighted 3 major things, which you can see there. The first is importance of national unity. He really wanted people to remember it was still a young nation, and that it was really important that they stuck together and saw themselves as Americans. The next thing he wanted to highlight, and again, it was about sticking together, was avoiding political parties. He had not been a part of any political party, but the members of his cabinet, Jefferson and Hamilton, had actually started to create two separate parties, and Washington worried that these two factions would actually tear the country apart. The last thing that he said, or his last piece of advice, was to avoid foreign attachment. So he didn't want the US to get involved in alliances because that would drag them into wars involuntarily, and Washington was hoping for a very peaceful existence for the United States of America. By all means, he thought that commerce was a good idea and international business relations was great, but international military relations were not good. And I will say, to the United States' credit, they did not join an alliance until 1949, which is pretty impressive considering this was 1796, and that alliance was NATO. Now, it isn't all smiles and sunshine for Georgie. We have focused on some of the good stuff, but we need to take a look at a major part of the other side of his presidency, and that's slavery. Washington was a slaveholder, and he'd become one of the country's richest men by using slave labor. The U.S. Constitution says that slaves should be returned to their masters, but it doesn't provide any explanation of how that will work. Now, this is in the Constitution, it's Article 4, Section 2. The Constitution also says that selling slaves within the United States or importing slaves from abroad will be protected until 1808. And then adding to that, they say that a tax or a duty, so a federal revenue source, slavery will become a federal revenue source, which is quite an endorsement of slavery. So that's what the Constitution says. In 1793, Congress passes and Washington signs something called the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act says that slave owners can recover their slaves from other states and that it's illegal to assist an escaping slave or an escaped slave. So a slave escapes servitude in Virginia, they make their way to Vermont where there is no slavery, and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 says that that slave owner can go back up to Vermont or hire someone to go back up to go to Vermont, track down that slave, and bring them back, that they are not free. The law also said that escaped slaves could be apprehended in any U.S. state or territory, and that the slave owner also had possession of any children that the escaped slave may have had while they were away. That's an incredible piece of legislation. I don't mean incredible in a positive way. The next law that was passed in 1794 that I want to talk about is the Slave Trade Act. And the Slave Trade Act says that Americans could not instigate the slave trade. They could continue to buy and sell slaves domestically, but they were not allowed to sell slaves internationally. Now, some of Washington apologists have argued that Washington's track record on slavery cannot be held against him too strongly because he was a product of his time. Another defense is that his job as president was to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, and the Constitution allowed slavery, so he allowed slavery. You can decide how those arguments sit with you, because ultimately, that decision is up to you. For some, Washington's endorsement of slavery by signing the two slave acts is enough for them to argue that he was not a very good president. I will say that he was an effective president. If you think of the country as a newborn, Washington protected it from foreign influence, defended it against rebellion, and helped establish the stronger central government that the framers of the Constitution had hoped for. It's reasonable to conclude that had a less respected, less charismatic individual been elected president in 1789, the new country might not have emerged as whole as it did after its first 8 years. Thank you very much for watching this video about
American history.